All right, so that's how you use your muscle as a spring. Really, it's about getting the stored energy within the tendon, having a quick little dynamic contraction that's going to use that stored energy and convert it into kinetic energy that's going to get it back moving in the opposite direction as fast as possible. But really, the core of what we look at for endurance is motor endurance and strut endurance. So motor endurance is when you use your muscle as a motor to overcome inertia. So it has to produce positive power. And it's the shortening force of the muscle is really important. So at the start of the sprint, so I showed you that in the first video, the runners with a single biological leg were able to start faster because they had muscle. Using that muscle as a motor allowed them to sprint, overcome the inertia of the start to sprint, to use their muscle as a motor to get up to speed. When you have individuals playing sports like soccer or field hockey or lacrosse, where you have to really quickly accelerate, decelerate, change direction, run in a different direction. That is a motor sport. Cycling, when you're using your quadriceps muscles and your hamstring muscles as to shorten, to quadriceps to push down in the pedal stroke, and hamstrings to pull up in the pedal stroke to overcome the inertia of you on the road. Swimming, when I'm going to catch, I'm going to pull, use my back and my triceps to overcome the inertia of the water. Rowing, when I'm going to use my back, my arms, and my legs to overcome the inertia of the water again. And so all of these events are motor endurance events. The sprint isn't really an endurance event, but any type of time, another way of running, and we'll see it in a second, is if you go mountain running. So if you're going to run up a mountain, you're going to use your muscles as a motor, not as a strut. So if you're looking at any of these different types of endurance performance, you're using your shortening contractions to overcome inertia, and that's when you use your muscle as a motor. What I'm going to show you now is that you use your muscle as a strut when it transmits force from one tendon directly to the other, and that means that you're using stored energy, and this is an isometric contraction. And what that isometric contraction allows you to do is store as much energy as possible within the tendon and then return that energy for the least amount of cost. And the only type of endurance event that uses this is straight line running. If you're going to run and you're going to be a road runner, that's not like Wile E. Coyote in the Road Runner, but somebody who's going to be like a 10K runner or a marathon runner who's going to go out onto the roads and run straight, that's a strut endurance event. All right, so why is this important? Well, this is a really nice paper that looked at the metabolic cost of different types of contractions. And so they either did isometric contractions, concentric or shortening contractions, and eccentric contractions. And it should make sense to you that we use ATP when myosin grabs, when it lets go of actin, that's when it binds a new ATP. And when it reaches out again, that's when it cuts the ATP and uses the energy. Okay, so really, the more we go through this power stroke with myosin binding to actin, the more energy we're going to use, because that's when it's going to detach, reach, and grab. Detach, reach, and grab. And it's the detach and reach where we're using energy. All right? So in an isometric contraction, the myosin heads are in the contracted position. They don't have to cycle. There's one or two that slip or lose their grip on actin, and then they have to detach, reach, and grab again. But most of them are going to stay adhered, myosin bound to actin. That's why when an individual dies, they lose energy. Now their muscles go through a period of rigor mortis. And rigor mortis is basically the myosin and the actin are stuck together because there's no ATP to allow release and stretch. So if you can do that type of contraction when you're dead, it obviously doesn't take much energy. Okay, so the least metabolically costly, you're going to use the least phosphocreatine because you're not using ATP, so you don't deplete the phosphocreatine to regenerate the ATP. Use 2/3 less of that energy doing an isometric contraction than you do during a concentric contraction. An eccentric contraction is in between, where it's about 50% less than a concentric contraction. Again, that's because during an eccentric contraction, yes, you're going to have to get to the point where it's being lengthened and it has to let go and then re-grab, let go, reach, and re-grab and try and get back into that position of holding. But it's not going to be nearly as much cycling as happens during a concentric contraction. And what that means is the more we can use our muscles isometrically when we run, the more efficient we're going to be. Okay, so that brings us to the second paper that we looked at. And this is by Tom Roberts. And TJ is one of the best scientists in the world that I know of. Smart as hell and really, really good, really top-end scientist. Okay, and what he did in this experiment was a pretty simple experiment. So he put a length and force sensor both within the calf muscle as well as within the calf tendon in a turkey. And then he just had the turkeys run along this treadmill, and it was a instrumented treadmill, so he had a force plate under the treadmill so that he could measure force when they hit the ground, but he also could measure force directly in the muscle using these piezoelectric crystals. Okay, so what he can do is he can measure the length of the muscle throughout the swing and the stance phase. He can measure the electrical activity that's coming to the muscle, and he can measure the force that the muscle is producing during all of these different stages. All right, so let's take a look at this. So they start with toe off, and they're going to swing the muscle or swing the foot forward, and sure enough, the muscle is going to get longer. You know that because you have to stretch out the calf muscle in order to lift your toes and reach for the next step. Look what happens though here. So before you hit the ground, your muscle begins to shorten. And when your muscle hits the ground, it's actually in a much shorter position than it was at the peak of the swing phase, even though it's still in that lengthened, the foot is still in that lengthened position. So what you've done is you've taken up the slack between the two ends of the muscle. Okay, so the muscle is shortened so that it's taken up the slack, and so it's preloaded. So what you've done is you've used electrical activity in the brain here to start moving that muscle to shorten it. Then right before you hit the ground, you get a big burst of electrical activity, and that's going to now tighten the muscle so that you can do this contraction. But look, you're on the ground and you're going from hitting the ground here, that leg coming forward, your toes coming up, and then springing off. Look at the length of the muscle. It's not contracting. So then you might think that it's not producing force, but yet, look at the force it's producing. Huge amount of force here. No change in length of the muscle. By definition, that's an isometric contraction. Okay, so what that means is we're getting an isometric contraction when he's running on the flat surface. And in order to maximize that isometric contraction, you have to activate the muscle before you hit the ground, because that preload is going to allow you to store and return more energy. This is what we call active tension or active stiffness. So passive stiffness is how much flexibility you have. So I can't move my hand past here, so that means I'm actively stiff within the tendons and muscles within my forearm. But passive or active stiffness means that if I use my muscle contract, now I can actually become stiff in that wrist much earlier. So if I'm relaxed, that's my passive stiffness limit. If I tense, now I actually can get more energy and I can be stiffer in that structure. That's going to allow me to store more energy within these tendons and return it to my body to get free energy for motion. Okay? What happens when you have that animal run up a hill? All you have to do is increase the grade on the treadmill. And now what you can see is there's the swing phase, still lengthening the muscle, still shortening the muscle before you hit the ground. But now look what you hit the ground here, and now what kind of contraction are we doing? That type of contraction where you're decreasing the length of the muscle is a shortening contraction. You're producing a lot of force. So a shortening contraction is when you're using your muscle as a motor. So now what you're doing is you're using your muscle as a motor to overcome the inertia of the hill, and therefore this is no longer a strut endurance event. It's now a motor endurance event. So why does that matter? Well, if you go out running here in Davis and you decide to do a route that takes you to East Davis, right at the I-80 overpass where you go over Mount Davis, and you're running along, totally good, then you start going up the hill, and it starts becoming harder. You start breathing harder. And why are you breathing harder? Well, you're breathing harder because you're not storing and returning energy. You're using your muscle as a motor instead of as a strut. And when you use your muscle as a motor, it costs you 3 times more energy than when you use it as a strut. That energy, where are we going to get it? Aerobic system. We're going to need to breathe more. We're going to need to deliver more oxygen. All right? So when we do this, as we increase speed, if we go back to the flat surface, here's the speed that the animal can run. Here's the muscle work. This is how much the muscle is shortening, how much work it does per step. What you can see is the muscle does a small amount of work, but look at the tendon. The tendon is doing much, much more work. It's always at least twice the work of the muscle. So here where the muscle is doing about 2 joules per kilogram body weight of work, the tendon is doing about 7 kilojoules or joules per kilogram body weight of work. So that means that most of the work, most of the stretch recoil that's going to provide the force that's going to move this individual forward is coming from the tendon. And we're going to use passive and active stiffness in order to maximize energy recovery from the tendon. And that's really where our running economy is going to come from. If we have a stiff tendon, that we can passively be stiff, but also actively make that even stiffer, that's going to give us the maximal performance adaptation. So what we want to have is we want to have a small or enough passive stiffness so that we don't have to use too much muscle contraction. And then we're going to use a short isometric contraction that's going to be holding the muscle constant length so that the tendon can stretch and recoil, and we're getting that energy back for free. All right, the better you are at active stiffness and passive stiffness, the less energy it's going to cost you to go the speed that you need to go.